October 2019. 30 miles outside Pike County, Alabama, the abandoned Blackwood coal mine breathes a damp chill that clings to stone and memory. A lone flashlight sweeps across timbered tunnels and shattered rails, a patrol for teenage trespassers that should have ended with warnings and a drive home. Instead, Deputy Marcus Tanner's beam touches a wall that should not exist, a newer barrier of rock and lumber where there ought to be only collapse and dust. A breath held, a glove searching the gaps, threads of faded fabric, the unmistakable curve of human bone, and half drowned in silt, a silver locket grimed by decades, initials SM etched into its face like a whisper from 1974. The silence tightens. A radio call rises and bounces down the shaft. Backup now, the coroner now, because this is not just a discovery. This is a door creaking open on 45 years of small-town fear, on a case that split neighbors, and on a suspect no one wanted to imagine, who sealed this hidden chamber and walked free through Pike County for nearly half a century. What finally surfaced in 2019 that the first investigation missed in 1974. If you want to uncover these answers with me, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and turn on the bell icon for upcoming episodes. Tell me the city you are watching from, and let us reach 5,000 likes so this cold case reaches more people who care. Deputy Marcus Tanner advances with measured steps, the tunnel air heavy with coal dust and the taste of metal. He angles the light again, not a natural cave-in but a deliberate barricade. Angular timbers cut square, stones chosen to lock tight. He radios his position, marks the coordinates on the tunnel map, and waits for the second unit to arrive because one wrong touch could bring the roof down. The second beam joins the first. Together they start to ease away stones, recording each move, preserving each layer. Behind the last brace, the alcove opens, a narrow recess carved into the wall just large enough for two. Two sets of remains lie arranged side by side, uniforms long since turned to brittle cloth but still a recognizable blue, hands placed close as if someone had lingered over that detail. The beam finds the locket again, SM, and the breath in the tunnel changes. The radio call is steady now. Control. I need backup at the old Blackwood site and send the coroner. His voice carries down the damp stone and dies at the next bend. Perimeter tape goes up at the mine mouth while engineers assess the stability of the shaft. The Pike County Sheriff's Department, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, and federal agents converge as floodlights push back the dark that has owned this hill since the early 80s. No one says the names yet, but everyone knows the story. The Martinez twins disappeared after a shift at Murphy's Diner in October 1974, and a silver locket went missing with them. Now the mine that fed the town's paychecks has begun to give up its secrets. Teams diagram the alcove, photograph every angle, and prepare for careful removal. Outside, radios crackle and breath fogs in the night air. Inside, the tunnel waits with the patience of rock. The call for the coroner is more than protocol. It is the first official step toward answers that families and detectives have chased across 4.5 decades. The stakes rise with every numbered evidence marker. A community that argued itself raw in the 70s will soon face a name pulled from old interview notes. Not a drifter, not a shadow slipping down the highway, someone known, someone trusted, someone who stood at vigils and shook the hands of the grieving. In the wash of the work lights, Tanner looks once more at the tarnished silver locket. The initials are clear under the grime. The path forward is set. The past is no longer buried. The discovery at Blackwood Mine was never meant to be just the closing chapter of a missing persons case. It was the spark that set off a chain reaction, tearing through decades of silence and shaking the foundation of Pike County itself. When Deputy Tanner uncovered those two fragile skeletons side by side beneath the earth, he did more than recover what was lost. He cracked open the longest-kept secret in a town that had forgotten how to speak its truth. For 45 years, the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez was a ghost story, whispered in diners and church halls, a tale told to new deputies by veterans who still carried the case files in the trunks of their cars. But that October night in 2019, everything began to shift. The evidence unearthed from that narrow alcove would trigger fresh investigation, new forensic testing, and finally, a name that would leave everyone stunned. Because when the arrest came, it was not a stranger passing through or a long-dead drifter. It was not the face from old wanted posters or a rumor brought back to life by curiosity. It was someone who had lived among them for decades, who had smiled across fences and sat in church pews beside their neighbors. Someone trusted, someone ordinary, someone who had carried an unimaginable secret while the entire town searched around him. That is what makes this story more than just a tragedy from the past. It is a portrait of a small community forced to look inward, to face how easily darkness can hide in plain sight when it wears the face of the familiar. The discovery at Blackwood Mine did not just end the search. It began a reckoning. The truth that Pike County had buried beneath coal and time was about to rise to the surface once more, and the first wave of shock was only beginning to ripple through the town. What else lay hidden in the shadows of that quiet Alabama county, waiting to be brought into the light? The discovery at Blackwood Mine did more than solve a mystery. It reopened old wounds that had never fully healed. For almost half a century, the Martinez family had lived between hope and heartbreak, refusing to let the memory of Sarah and Rebecca fade into rumor. Their persistence became the backbone of a case that everyone else had quietly given up on. The detectives who refused to let the file gather dust, the forensic scientists who used modern tools to give voice to the long silent, and a community that once tore itself apart, now forced to face the truth that had been waiting right beneath their feet. Pike County had never forgotten the twins. Their faces had stared down from fading posters in store windows, from framed photographs in the sheriff's office, from newspaper clippings tucked inside family Bibles. But what no one expected was that the person responsible for their disappearance had been part of their daily lives all along. He had smiled at vigils. He had shaken the hands of detectives. He had even stood in the background of family gatherings meant to honor the missing, all while keeping their secret buried beneath the same ground he once worked on as part of the Blackwell Mining Company. That was the cruelest irony of all. The key suspect had been there from the very beginning, interviewed in the original investigation, dismissed as just another face in the crowd. He slipped quietly through the cracks of an overworked sheriff's department, and then lived out his life in peace, blending perfectly into the rhythm of the same town that had once searched every inch of its soil for the truth. For the Martinez family, the truth came as both an answer and a burden. Their pain, once private, became public again. For the detectives who had chased this case through decades of dead ends, it became proof that time could delay justice but never erase it. And for Pike County itself, the revelation was like a mirror held too close to the face. It forced everyone to remember how easily suspicion once divided them, how neighbors had accused neighbors, how trust had withered under the weight of fear. The town that had prided itself on knowing everyone discovered that it never really had. Beneath every friendly wave and familiar smile, there might have been something darker waiting to be seen. What if the answers to those 45 years of questions had always been standing right beside the ones asking them? The story that began in the dark tunnels of Blackwood Mine does not end with the discovery of 2 forgotten lives. It stretches back across 45 long years of searching, grieving, and waiting. To understand how this secret stayed buried for so long, we have to travel back to where it all began. October 1974. A time when Pike County still felt safe, when families left their doors unlocked, and when 2 young sisters ended their shift at a local diner without knowing they were walking into history. This journey will trace the last hours of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez as they left Murphy's Diner and vanished into the Alabama night. We will walk through the panic that spread through their small town, the endless searches that followed, and the heartbreaking years their family spent chasing shadows. We will see how the case fell silent, how the trail went cold, and how technology decades later uncovered what human memory could not. We will uncover how a single locket became the thread that tied everything together, how advances in forensic science turned faded evidence into a voice that demanded to be heard, and how the truth, once revealed, shattered the illusion of safety in a town that thought it already knew all of its ghosts. Every step in this story is a piece of a larger puzzle, one that connects the innocence of 1974 with the reckoning of 2019. A story of justice delayed, but not denied. What really happened on that quiet October evening when the Martinez twins took their final walk home? To understand the mystery that haunted Pike County for nearly half a century, you must first see the world the Martinez twins knew in 1974. Pike County was a small, tightly knit community of about 25,000 people, spread across rolling farmland and quiet neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of place where Sunday service filled every pew, where a handshake meant more than a signature, and where the sound of a passing train or a barking dog could carry across the entire valley. The Vietnam War had ended only a short time before, but its shadow still lingered. 17 young men from Pike County had not returned, and those who did came home changed, quieter, carrying memories they rarely shared. The civil rights movement had touched this part of Alabama too, but progress had moved slowly. Schools were integrated, though not without tension, and many families still spoke in hushed tones about the old days, unsure of what the new ones meant. The local economy, once steady, had begun to shift. Factories that produced farm equipment and textiles were reducing shifts. Small family farms were fighting to survive. But one industry still held strong: coal. The Blackwell Mining Company provided work for hundreds of men, steady pay for their families, and the sense that even if the rest of the world was changing, Pike County still stood on something solid. The mine was dangerous, yes, but it was also dependable, and for many, it was the only life they knew. At the heart of this rural county sat the town of Troy, a modest hub where life unfolded around the courthouse square. On weekday mornings, shopkeepers swept the sidewalks before opening their stores. On Fridays, local bands played outside the old hardware shop while children ran barefoot across the grass. Doors stayed unlocked. Car keys were left in ignitions. There was a shared belief that nothing truly bad could happen here, but that sense of safety was a fragile illusion. The world was changing, faster than most in Pike County could keep up with. Beneath the calm surface, small-town routines hid unspoken fears, buried resentments, and secrets that no one wanted to name. No one in Troy could have imagined that within a single October night, that quiet peace would shatter forever, and two young sisters would vanish from the heart of their trusting little town, without leaving a trace in the heart of Troy. Just across from the courthouse square stood Murphy's Diner, a small red brick building with fogged windows and the smell of coffee and bacon that drifted out every morning. It was the meeting point of the town, where miners, teachers, and farmers shared the same worn stools and traded stories before the day began. If Pike County had a heartbeat, it pulsed inside that diner. The Martinez family had moved to Alabama from Arizona in 1965. Robert Martinez, the father, had come seeking steady work when the mine in Tucson shut down. He found it at Blackwell Mining Company, a dangerous job but one that promised stability. His wife, Maria, worked part-time at the church kitchen, known for her calm smile and her faith that carried the family through every hardship. Together they built a modest life on the outskirts of Troy, raising 4 children: Miguel, Lucia, and the twins who would one day become the center of the town's most haunting story. Sarah and Rebecca Martinez were born in the summer of 1956. Identical in face, but worlds apart in spirit. Sarah, the quieter one, kept her hair parted to the left and carried a small notebook everywhere she went, filled with sketches and her dream of becoming a nurse. She was thoughtful, cautious, the kind who always looked both ways twice before crossing a street. Rebecca, or Becca as everyone called her, parted her hair to the right. She had a voice that turned heads, played the guitar at Sunday gatherings, and dreamed of Nashville. Where Sarah saw structure and safety, Becca saw adventure and open roads. They balanced each other perfectly, one grounded, one daring, one steady, one spontaneous. They were known around town as the Sunshine Twins, always side by side, laughing, teasing, finishing each other's sentences. At Murphy's Diner, they were more than employees, and they were family. They worked the afternoon shift, serving pie and refilling coffee for the same regulars who had watched them grow up. The diner's manager, Frank Murphy, often said the place felt empty without their laughter. He once described them as two halves of the same song, Sarah the melody, Rebecca the rhythm. Even when they disagreed, they were inseparable. If one called in sick, the other would show up anyway. It was rare to see one without the other, and that was how everyone remembered them. Together. No one inside Murphy's Diner could have guessed that the same familiarity, the same predictable routine of that October evening, would be the last time anyone would ever see both sisters alive. What path did the Martinez twins take after leaving Murphy's Diner that night? And what unseen eyes followed them into the dark October 17th, 1974? The day began like any other for Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. The sky was clear, the air carried the faint chill of early autumn, and the diner filled quickly with the noise of boots, laughter, and the smell of frying oil. The twins clocked in at 2 o'clock that afternoon, sliding on their aprons, hair neatly tied back, greeting every customer by name as they always did. It was payday, which meant the place stayed busier than usual. Coal miners crowded the counter after long shifts underground, and the sisters darted between tables with practiced rhythm, passing each other with small smiles and quiet jokes. At exactly 8:07 they clocked out. The shift had been long but not unusual. Frank Murphy, the manager, remembered their goodbye that night, Sarah reminding him to check the freezer temperature before closing, Rebecca humming under her breath, spinning the keys on her finger. They stepped out into the soft orange glow of the streetlights, jackets buttoned, pay envelopes tucked neatly into Sarah's purse. Just a few blocks away, Henderson's pharmacy stayed open late. Security footage from a grainy black and white camera, one of the first in town, showed the twins entering at 8:12. They spent nearly 10 minutes inside laughing with the clerk, picking out a birthday card for their mother. A rose-themed one with a lace border. The clerk later said they were in good spirits, polite, smiling, no signs of worry. At 8:22 they walked out, heading east on Pine Street toward home. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. By 9:15 their mother began to worry. Dinner had gone cold on the table. Their father, Robert, thought perhaps the twins had stayed to help close the diner. He called, but the phone rang unanswered. By 10:30 he drove through town, checking the diner, the pharmacy, and the route home. Every corner felt too quiet, every minute heavier. When midnight came and there was still no sign of his daughters, Robert drove straight to the sheriff's office and filed a missing persons report. Deputies responded quickly at first, driving the same route, scanning the streets, and asking the night shift at Blackwell Mine if they had seen anything unusual. Nothing. No sound of a struggle. No broken glass. No tire marks leading away from the road. The sheriff, trying to calm a frantic family, said they would check again at first light. But deep down, both parents knew their daughters would never simply wander off. Something had happened between the pharmacy door and their own front porch. The next morning, the sun rose over Pike County to find the twins still missing, their rooms untouched, their beds neatly made. The birthday card they had bought for their mother never arrived. What unseen force had crossed their path that night and taken two young sisters off a quiet Alabama street without leaving a single trace? The night passed in uneasy silence. By sunrise, there was still no word from Sarah or Rebecca. Their mother sat by the window, eyes fixed on the road, waiting to see the familiar shape of her daughters walking up the path. But the sun rose higher, and the road remained empty. At first, the deputies treated the case with cautious optimism. They told Robert and Maria that maybe the girls had decided to visit a friend, that perhaps they would turn up by noon. In small towns like Troy, people believed things like that. But as the morning hours stretched into afternoon with no sign of the twins, optimism turned to unease. Officers retraced the route from Murphy's Diner to Henderson's Pharmacy, and then to the Martinez home. No broken fence, no scattered belongings, no skid marks, not even a sign of a struggle. It was as if the two sisters had simply vanished into thin air. By late afternoon, the sheriff authorized a full community search. Dozens of volunteers gathered near the courthouse square. Farmers brought trucks. Students brought flashlights. Neighbors who had known the twins since childhood walked the fields shoulder to shoulder. The local radio station interrupted its usual music program to broadcast a plea for information. The football game that weekend was postponed as more than half the town joined the search. Flyers with the twins' school photos were printed and taped to store windows, telephone poles, and car windshields. As night fell again, search parties moved through woods, creeks, and old mine paths with lanterns and dogs. Still, there was nothing. The town's energy began to shift from worry to dread. Maria clutched the birthday card still lying on the kitchen table, unopened, waiting while Robert paced the living room, his hands raw from gripping the flashlight too tightly. By the third day, the case had grown far beyond the small county's capacity. The FBI arrived to assist, bringing equipment and specialists unfamiliar to a place where most people had never even seen an agent before. They questioned friends, co-workers, and classmates. Every inch of the diner and pharmacy was examined. Then they searched the twins' bedroom, looking for any sign that might explain where they had gone. That was when the first real clue appeared. On Sarah's dresser sat a small empty chain. Her silver locket, the one engraved with her initials, the one she wore every single day, was missing. The discovery was small, almost insignificant at first, but it would later become the key that tied everything together, the object that would resurface 45 years later deep beneath the ground of Blackwood Mine. What unseen connection bound that missing locket to the very heart of Pike County's darkest secret? The first 72 hours passed, and still there was no trace of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. The search teams found nothing. No torn clothing along the roadside, no footprints in the ditches, no sign of a struggle between the pharmacy and their home. The dirt paths they often walked were undisturbed, as if the twins had stepped off the map completely. It was this absence, this haunting emptiness, that unsettled the investigators most. The FBI agents and county deputies mapped out every possible route the sisters might have taken that night. They interviewed residents door to door, asking if anyone had seen an unfamiliar car, or heard a sudden sound, or noticed headlights stopping where they should not. But for 2 long days nothing stood out. Until the reports began to align, 3 separate witnesses mentioning the same vehicle. Each described a mid-1960s blue Ford pickup truck with a dented left fender. 2 women from a nearby grocery store saw it idling by Pine Street shortly after 8:30 that night. Another witness, a paper delivery driver, claimed he saw the same truck turn off toward the old mining road around 9. The most intriguing detail came from a gas station attendant who remembered only part of the license plate, a 7 and a 4. It was not much, but it was the first real lead. Detectives began a full sweep of Pike County and the neighboring towns, checking vehicle registrations for blue pickups that matched the description. By the end of the week, they narrowed it down to 5 possible owners. Among them was a man named James Whitley. Whitley was 36 years old, a local mechanic who had worked briefly at Blackwell Mine before opening his small repair shop on the outskirts of town. When questioned, he appeared calm, even helpful. He admitted to owning a blue Ford with a dented fender, saying it had been damaged hauling lumber the month before. He provided an alibi. He claimed he had been home fixing his transmission that evening, and that his wife could confirm it. The deputies noted his statement, thanked him for his time, and let him go. But there was something about Whitley that stayed with investigators. His answers were practiced, almost rehearsed. His truck showed signs of recent cleaning, the kind that went beyond pride of ownership. And while his alibi seemed solid on paper, it never sat comfortably with the lead detective. Still, with no physical evidence and no witness able to identify the driver with certainty, there was nothing more they could do. Whitley's name was added quietly to an informal list. Persons of interest to be watched. But never officially accused. The blue pickup became the shadow of the investigation, appearing again and again in rumors and tips that led nowhere. To some, it was a coincidence. To others, it was the key that could unlock everything. What hidden truth was buried behind that blue truck? And the man who drove it through the streets of Pike County on the wee night the twins disappeared as the blue pickup lead began to cool. Investigators widened their search for answers. They turned their attention to anyone connected to the Martinez family, or to the twins themselves, hoping one name might finally break the silence. 3 men would soon come under scrutiny, each with a possible motive, and each with secrets of his own. The first was Victor Ramirez, a 27-year-old distant cousin who had traveled from Arizona to visit the Martinez family just weeks before the disappearance. He was charming, restless, and known to have a fondness for the twins, especially Sarah. Several relatives recalled how he had openly expressed admiration for her, and even hinted at wanting to stay longer in Alabama. When questioned, Victor admitted that he had feelings for Sarah but claimed she had rejected his advances politely. He told investigators that he had returned to Arizona 3 days before the twins vanished, and produced travel receipts and time cards from his employer as proof. The records appeared legitimate, but something about his demeanor struck the detectives as evasive, as if he were hiding more than he was saying. Still, the timeline held up. With no physical evidence placing him near Troy that night, Victor Ramirez was quietly crossed off the list. The second name belonged to a man with far more power in Pike County, Thomas Blackwell, the 56-year-old owner of Blackwell Mining Company. Rumors had circulated for years that Robert Martinez, the twins' father, had clashed with Blackwell over unsafe working conditions at the mine. Some whispered that Robert had threatened to report violations, while others suggested Blackwell had taken it as a personal insult. When questioned, Blackwell appeared confident, even dismissive, claiming he had been in Birmingham the night of October 17th for a business dinner. Several witnesses confirmed his presence, and the restaurant's sign-in record supported his alibi. Still, a few locals found it suspicious how quickly he distanced himself from the Martinez family afterward, even though Robert had worked under his company for nearly a decade. To the investigators, Blackwell represented what they had begun to call the shadow suspects. Powerful men insulated by status, always just beyond reach. Then came Daniel Cooper, a name that brought a different kind of unease. Daniel was 31 years old and had once dated Rebecca Martinez. Their relationship had ended 6 months before the disappearance, and according to friends, the breakup had not been amicable. Some described Daniel as controlling, others as heartbroken, but no one imagined him capable of violence. When he was called in for questioning, Daniel appeared visibly shaken, not angry but deeply distressed. He answered every question, even agreeing to take a polygraph test, which he passed without issue. His apartment was searched and no evidence tied him to the case. Still, detectives noted his continued fixation on Rebecca, mentioning her name in every conversation as if he were trying to convince himself she would come home. By early November, all 3 men had been investigated, questioned, and released. Each lead seemed promising at first. The cousin with unrequited feelings, the powerful employer with a history of conflict, the heartbroken ex-boyfriend. But every thread ended in the same place, nowhere. The case that had once gripped an entire county was now beginning to slip through everyone's fingers. The unanswered question that haunted investigators remained the same. If none of these men were responsible, Then who had followed Sarah and Rebecca Martinez into the darkness that October night? And how had they vanished without leaving a single trace behind? By the time November settled over Pike County, the investigation into the disappearance of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez had lost its momentum. The leads had grown thin, the witnesses uncertain, and the evidence almost non-existent. The deputies who had once filled their days with interviews and late-night searches now found themselves waiting for tips that rarely came. Even the sound of the radio updates, once urgent and hopeful, began to fade from the airwaves. The Martinez home remained a gathering place for volunteers who still refused to give up, but even their numbers began to dwindle. The days grew shorter, and so did the patience of those who had once promised answers. Sheriff Donovan held fewer press briefings, repeating the same hollow phrase, that all available leads were being pursued, even though there were no new leads left to chase. Then, on December 3rd, everything changed. Not for the Martinez family, but for Pike County law enforcement. Less than 50 miles away in Harmon County, the largest bank robbery in Alabama's history had just taken place. 3 people were dead, and more than $200,000 were gone. It was chaos. Every available officer, agent, and state investigator was reassigned to the manhunt. Patrol cars that had once circled Troy searching for signs of the twins now raced north to chase armed fugitives. The Martinez case, once the heartbeat of the community, was quietly pushed to the background. The sheriff's department could not admit it publicly, but their priorities had shifted. The missing sisters became another open file stacked beneath more urgent crimes. The flyers posted in shop windows began to yellow under the sun. The photographs of Sarah and Rebecca, once bright with youthful smiles, curled at the edges and blurred beneath the glass. By Christmas, the daily searches had stopped entirely. The radio stopped mentioning their names. People still whispered about the case, but now it was with resignation instead of urgency. The Martinez family lights burned late into every night, the faint glow of hope against a town that was beginning to move on. The sheriff never declared the case closed, but the silence that followed said enough. It was no longer an active pursuit. It had become a cold trail waiting for time or fate to stir it back to life. What no one in Pike County could have known then was that the answers they were desperate for were already buried deep beneath the ground, sealed away in darkness, waiting for discovery nearly half a century later. When the new year of 1975 arrived, hope in Pike County was thin as frost on the ground. The Martinez case, once the pulse of every household and headline, had slipped into silence. Yet the question everyone kept asking was why? Why did the search fade so quickly? Why did the truth stay buried for so long? The answer, as investigators would later uncover, was not one single failure, but a chain of small, crucial ones that together sealed the fate of the investigation. The truth was that the sheriff's department of 1974 was simply not equipped for a case of this magnitude. Their experience lay in handling local disputes, thefts, and the occasional traffic accident, not a double disappearance that would demand forensic precision and statewide coordination. Modern technology, the kind that could have traced footprints or extracted DNA from the smallest fragment, did not exist. What they had were photographs, handwritten notes, and instinct, tools that could not compete with the scale of what they were facing. Pike County itself added to the challenge. It was a land of dense pine woods, sprawling farmland, and abandoned mining shafts stretching for miles beneath the earth. Every hollow, every ravine, every creek bed could have hidden something, or nothing. Search teams combed fields and forest paths for weeks, but without knowing what they were looking for, every trail led to emptiness. The investigators also suffered from what one retired deputy would later call tunnel vision. From the moment the blue pickup truck was reported, nearly all attention focused there. The truck became the heart of the case, and everything else was pushed aside. Even promising leads that did not fit the truck theory were dismissed or lost in the noise. One of those forgotten reports would haunt the department decades later. A witness who had seen an unfamiliar beige station wagon idling near the Martinez home around 9 o'clock that night. The driver was never identified, the sighting never fully investigated. The report was filed away, buried beneath pages of interviews about the blue truck. There were no security cameras along the girl's route, no eyewitnesses past the pharmacy clerk, and no clear signs of a crime scene. Without physical evidence or fresh testimony, the case stood still. The lack of closure weighed heavily on the Martinez family, but it also carved a deeper wound into the community itself. For the first time, people began to realize that evil could hide even in a place where everyone thought they knew one another. The years ahead would only deepen that silence, until the day the discovery in an abandoned mine would finally force those old failures back into the light. Inside the Martinez home, time stopped at October 17th. The kitchen calendar was never turned. The same date, circled in red ink, stared back at them every morning as if the world beyond it had ceased to exist. The twins' shoes still sat neatly by the front door. Their school books remained stacked on the dining table. Their bedroom, untouched, held the faint scent of rose lotion and the soft hum of a record player that no one dared to switch on again. The house became both a shrine and a prison, a place where memory and grief lived side by side. Robert Martinez could not return to the mine after that night. Every sound of the heavy machinery reminded him of the ground swallowing secrets, of the noise that could hide a cry for help. So he left. Using his savings, he converted the old garage behind their home into what he called his command center. He covered the walls with maps, marked every possible path the twins could have taken, and pinned red threads between every name the sheriff had ever mentioned. Neighbors saw the light on in that garage long after midnight. Robert sitting at his desk writing notes, calling distant counties, sending letters to anyone who might have heard something. His hair grayed early. His hands trembled more each winter. The stress began to eat away at his health, but he refused to stop searching. To him, the case had not gone cold. It was only waiting for the right question to be asked. Maria found her own way to endure the silence. Every night she lit 2 candles by the window, one for each daughter, and prayed until the wick burned out. Her faith became her armor and her routine her only comfort. She never moved a single thing in the twins' room. Their beds stayed made, their dresses folded, their photographs dusted every morning. Neighbors who visited said she spoke softly, as if afraid her voice might disturb them, as though her daughters were simply sleeping in the next room. Over the years, her world grew smaller. The church and her home were the only places she went. Miguel and Lucia, the younger siblings, bore their own weight in silence. Miguel was 16, restless, angry at a world that had taken his sisters and given him no one to blame. He spent more time away from home, working odd jobs, trying to escape the grief that filled every corner of the house. Lucia, barely 14, took the opposite path. She stayed. She helped her mother with meals, comforted her father when he collapsed in exhaustion, and kept her sister's memories alive with quiet strength. Family from Arizona visited often in those first few years, but over time the visits faded, the letters slowed, and the Martinez family became a portrait of quiet endurance, still standing, but frozen in loss. Through it all, Robert's maps remained on the garage wall, a forest of red lines that led nowhere. But one pin, one note scrawled in his handwriting, would decades later become the clue that tied the family's pain to the truth that was waiting. Underground, what connection had Robert unknowingly marked on that wall that would one day reopen the darkest chapter in Pike County's history? Time moved on even when the Martinez family could not. By the early 1980s, Pike County began to change. The old dirt roads that once carried miners and milk trucks were paved over with asphalt. A new highway cut through the edge of town, connecting Troy to Montgomery, bringing in new people, new stores, and a new rhythm that felt faster, louder, and somehow less personal. The quiet corners that had once held whispered prayers for Sarah and Rebecca were now surrounded by construction noise and neon signs. Murphy's Diner, the place where the twins had laughed through their last shift, closed in 1986. The red brick building stood empty for a year before being torn down to make way for a parking lot near a strip mall. Henderson's Pharmacy, where the girls had bought the rose card for their mother, was absorbed by a national drugstore chain. The familiar bell over the door was replaced by an automatic sliding entrance, and no one who worked there remembered the clerk who had spoken to the twins that night. Even the mine entrances that once defined Pike County's identity were sealed off. Some were filled with concrete, others fenced and forgotten under layers of weeds and soil. The physical traces of that October night were slowly erased, buried beneath decades of progress. As the town modernized, so too did its memory shift. For the newer generations, the disappearance of the Martinez twins became more of a story than an open wound. Parents would whisper it to their children on stormy nights, warning them not to walk alone down Pine Street after dark. Teenagers would dare each other to visit the overgrown paths near the old mine, saying the twins' spirits still wandered there. It was no longer an investigation. It was folklore, a legend with blurred edges. Yet for those who had lived through it, the change was painful. The people who remembered the girls felt their memory being paved over, replaced by convenience stores and gas stations. Each new building seemed to stand on a piece of history that had been quietly taken. The sheriff's office eventually archived the Martinez file under cold cases. It gathered dust, aging alongside the people who had once promised to solve it. But despite the years and the growth around it, Pike County still carried something beneath its surface, a sense that the town had never truly buried its ghosts. Some locals claimed that every October, the air near the old mine turned colder than anywhere else in the county, as if the ground itself still remembered what had been hidden there. And one day, that same ground would finally give up its secret, not by chance, but by the swing of a flashlight in a place no one was meant to enter again. Over the next 4 decades, the case of the Martinez twins refused to fade completely. It lingered like a faint echo, resurfacing every few years when new sheriffs, new technology, or a faint glimmer of hope promised answers that never came. In 1979, 5 years after the disappearance, a new sheriff named Harold Tucker reopened the file. He formed a small task force made up of deputies and volunteers determined to re-examine every lead. That same summer, a carnival had passed through Pike County, and rumors began to circulate about a drifter who had worked briefly at the fairgrounds. The man matched a vague description given by a woman who claimed she had seen someone arguing with 2 young girls near Pine Street around the time the twins vanished. Investigators tracked the lead for weeks, following a trail of employment records that stretched across 3 southern states. But before they could bring the man in for questioning, word came that he had died in a highway accident near Baton Rouge. His name was never released publicly, and the lead died with him. In 1984, the FBI stepped in once more to build a psychological profile of the possible offender. Their conclusion was chilling. The report suggested that whoever took Sarah and Rebecca had likely been local, someone familiar with both their routines and the geography of Pike County. It was not a random act. The offender, they believed, had specifically targeted the twins. The profile reignited public interest for a time, but no new evidence surfaced. A decade later, in 1994, forensic science had advanced enough to spark new hope. DNA testing had begun to revolutionize cold case work across the country. Samples from the Martinez evidence box were sent to a state lab. For weeks, the family held their breath, praying that modern science might finally speak for their daughters. But the results were devastating. The materials, a small ribbon found near the creek and a strand of hair collected from an early search, were too degraded for viable DNA. The ribbon was later confirmed to belong to another child, unrelated to the twins. Once again, the case returned to silence. In 2002, Alabama's Bureau of Investigation created a cold case unit and the Martinez file was one of the first to be digitized. Old photographs, witness statements, and maps were scanned and preserved. It gave the illusion of progress, but the data held no new secrets. Then in 2008, construction crews digging near the highway unearthed human bones. For 2 tense weeks, the town held its breath. But when forensic analysis came back, the bones were determined to be historical, dating to the 1800s, likely from a forgotten cemetery. The hope that had briefly sparked was extinguished again. Through the 2010s, the story of the Martinez twins shifted fully into folklore. Teenagers whispered it at bonfires, claiming to see 2 figures walking hand in hand along Pine Street under the full moon. But for the family, there was no legend and an only loss. Robert passed away in 2011, his map still pinned to the garage wall. Maria followed 3 years later, her final candle still burning in the window. Only Lucia remained in Troy, now in her 50s, keeping the memory alive with quiet dignity. Decades of failed leads and false alarms had dulled the county's belief that justice would ever come. But beneath the ground, the truth had never disappeared. It had only been waiting and sealed in darkness, untouched and ready to be found when the earth itself could no longer keep its secret. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon in October of 2019, when Pike County finally stirred the silence that had lasted 45 years. Deputy Marcus Tanner, a young officer barely in his 30s, was dispatched to the abandoned Blackwood mine after a call came in from a farmer reporting trespassing teens. It sounded routine, nothing more than a warning or a citation, but what Tanner found inside those collapsed tunnels would rewrite one of Alabama's oldest mysteries. The mine sat 30 miles outside Troy, sealed decades ago after an explosion made it too dangerous to enter. Weeds and rust had claimed the fences, and the air inside carried the heavy scent of coal and decay. As Tanner moved through the narrow passage with his flashlight cutting through the dust, he noticed something strange. A section of the tunnel wall looked different. It was not natural rock. Someone had built a barrier there by hand, a wall of old timber, stones, and compacted dirt. It did not belong. At first, he thought it might have been part of an old mining support structure. But when he leaned closer, he saw nails that were newer than the rest, bent, uneven, and hammered by someone who did not know what they were doing. Tanner radioed for backup, his voice steady but his pulse racing. Within hours, the site was sealed off, and a team of state investigators arrived. When they began to dismantle the barrier piece by piece, what lay behind it froze everyone in silence. 2 shallow recesses in the earth, 2 sets of remains, side by side. The air turned heavy as if the mine itself had been holding its breath for decades. Among the fragments of fabric and brittle bone was something that caught the light. A small silver locket, tarnished but intact, with the initials SM faintly engraved on the back. Excavation became delicate and dangerous. The tunnels were unstable, threatening to collapse under the weight of the equipment. University anthropologists from Birmingham were called in to assist, using soft brushes and small tools to preserve every trace of evidence. Each bone was catalogued, each piece of soil sifted carefully. The remains were transported under full escort to the state forensic lab, where advanced DNA testing was used to make the identification. It took weeks of quiet waiting before the results returned. The DNA matched perfectly to samples still preserved from the Martinez family. After 45 years, it was confirmed. The remains belonged to Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. Fragments of old diner uniforms were found among the soil, pieces of faded fabric that once bore the Murphy's Diner logo. And the locket, the same one missing from Sarah's dresser since 1974, sealed the final confirmation. The discovery hit Pike County like a thunderclap. For older residents, it reopened wounds they thought had healed. For the Martinez relatives, it was closure wrapped in heartbreak. And for the investigators, it was something more. A door opening into the past, revealing not just the fate of 2 sisters, but the possibility that their disappearance had never been random at all. What truth would rise from those tunnels once the investigation reached the man whose name had lingered quietly on that old suspect list for nearly half a century. The discovery at Blackwood Mine brought the Martinez case back to life. But it was the work inside the forensic lab that began to reveal the truth hidden in the bones. The remains were fragile, but the story they carried had survived. Each fracture, each fragment, each trace of residue became a whisper from the past, waiting to be translated. The forensic pathologists started with the skeletal analysis. Both sisters had suffered identical injuries, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The blows were clean, deliberate, and consistent with a flat-faced tool, likely something heavy and metallic. It was not random violence, not the chaos of a struggle. It was precise, cold, executed from behind. That alone told investigators one devastating truth. Whoever had done this, the twins likely knew them. There had been no fight, no defense wounds, no attempt to run. They had trusted the person who led them into the dark. As the anthropologists continued their study, another detail stood out. The placement of the remains was far too deliberate to be accidental. The bodies had been carefully positioned, not discarded. Sarah's left arm rested lightly across Rebecca's, their heads angled slightly toward one another. It was not the work of panic. It was the work of someone who wanted them found together, or perhaps never found at all. It carried a sense of familiarity, maybe even remorse. Then came the trace evidence, the kind of detail only modern science could expose. From the soil samples around the remains, forensic technicians identified microscopic blue cotton fibers embedded in the sediment. They did not match the diner uniforms. They came from something else. Coarse industrial material, consistent with work shirts used by miners in the 1970s. Pollen analysis revealed traces from autumn ragweed, specific to the fields east of Troy. That meant the bodies had likely been moved after death, transported from one location to another, before being concealed in the mine. Whoever had done this had access to vehicles and the privacy to operate, unnoticed. But the most damning evidence came from a chemical trace found on one of the fractured skull fragments, a residue consistent with industrial lubricant used on mining tools. It carried a unique proprietary blend that had only been produced and distributed to one company in the region during that period: Blackwell Mining. When that detail reached the investigators, the room fell silent. The same company where Robert Martinez had once worked. The same mine now holding the remains of his daughters. The evidence did not just reopen a cold case. It narrowed the field to those who had lived and breathed that world. Men who knew the tunnels, men who had access to that lubricant, men who had once worked beneath the earth where Sarah and Rebecca had been hidden for 45 years. And among those names, one stood out: the man whose blue pickup had haunted the case from the very beginning. The man who had smiled through every question, and whose alibi had never felt quite right. When the forensic report reached the sheriff's desk, one name rose quietly from the past, a name buried for decades beneath half-forgotten notes and faded witness lists. Howard Keller. At the time of the disappearance, he had been a maintenance supervisor at Blackwell Mining Company, a man who knew every inch of the tunnels, every locked access road, every tool that came through the yard. He had been interviewed in 1974 just once, and then dismissed when his story seemed to check out. But now, with the new forensic evidence pointing directly toward Blackwell equipment, Keller's name burned at the top of the file like a signal flare. The re-examination of his old interview transcript revealed strange inconsistencies. Back then, Keller had claimed that on the night of October 17th, he had been home repairing a generator, with his wife confirming his story. But no one had ever verified that claim beyond her word, and when investigators went looking for that generator log decades later, it was missing from the records entirely. As the task force dug deeper, more unsettling facts surfaced. Before moving to Pike County, Keller had lived in Mississippi, where he had been questioned in connection with the disappearance of a 19-year-old waitress in 1969. The case went nowhere, and Keller had left the state just months later. 2 years after that, in 1971, he was arrested in Georgia following an assault complaint from a co-worker's daughter. But the charges were dropped when the victim refused to testify. There was no formal conviction, no lasting trace, only a pattern of proximity to young women who had disappeared or come to harm. Then came the most disturbing detail. During the original 1974 investigation, several regulars at Murphy's Diner had mentioned Keller as a frequent customer. They said he always sat in the same booth, the one closest to the kitchen, with a perfect view of the counter where the twins worked. The staff remembered him as quiet but watchful, the kind of man who never joined in conversation but never missed anything either. One co-worker recalled that Sarah, polite as always, would greet him kindly, but that she often avoided taking his table if she could. A few weeks before the disappearance, Keller had attempted small talk, asking about her shifts, her plans, even offering to drive her home once when it rained. Sarah had declined. The notes from that era described his behavior as unusual but not alarming. He was considered a harmless regular, but hindsight painted him differently. Not harmless, just patient. Someone who studied routine, who understood timing, and who knew where darkness and isolation would meet opportunity. Investigators could not ignore the way the pieces fit together. The blunt force injuries matched the kind of flat mining tool Keller used daily. The industrial lubricant found on the remains came from the maintenance stock he oversaw, and the tunnel where the bodies were found had been sealed under his supervision in early 1975, just months after the disappearance. For 45 years, he had lived freely, blending into the quiet rhythm of Pike County life. The man who had once slipped through every line of questioning was now at the center of it all. What would happen when investigators finally knocked on the door of the man who had outlived his secret for nearly half a century? 45 years of silence finally shattered when truth rose from the darkness beneath Pike County. Yet what lingered most was not the shock of discovery, but the quiet realization that time had never truly erased what happened. It had only hidden it. The story of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez was more than a tragedy. It was a reminder of how fragile justice can be when buried under dust, doubt, and neglect. Their case stood as a mirror to so many others that slipped through the cracks of time. Names lost in old files, evidence mislabeled, voices unheard. But when the light of attention returned, even after decades, the truth still spoke. It showed that persistence matters, that memory itself can be a form of justice, and that no cold case is ever truly closed until the full story is known. Across every town like Troy, there are still unanswered questions, still faces on faded posters, still families waiting by the window with the same hope Maria Martinez once held. The Martinez sisters' story reminds us that closure is not only about punishment, it is about peace. It is about remembering. Because the moment we stop asking what happened, that is when the forgotten truly disappear. For decades, Howard Keller lived like a shadow in plain sight. After 1974, while the Martinez family grieved in silence and the town searched for ghosts, Keller built the life of an ordinary man, the kind of life no one would ever question. He remained in Pike County, never moving far from the same roads the twins had once walked. His house sat at the edge of a pine grove, neat and symmetrical, with a trimmed yard and a white fence he painted twice a year. To neighbors he was polite but private, a man who kept to himself yet never gave a reason for suspicion. He attended Sunday service at the First Baptist Church every week, always dressed the same, pressed shirt, polished shoes, a folded handkerchief in his pocket. He volunteered to fix the chapel doors, the roof, even the nursery shelves. People described him as meticulous, the kind who never left a task unfinished. When he spoke, his tone was calm, practiced, almost rehearsed. It was the kind of calm that hides something far deeper beneath the surface. After his wife Elaine passed away in 2001, the town pitied him. She had been his opposite, social, kind, always the one who filled the silence when he would not speak. Her death left him alone, and yet somehow no one ever truly felt sorry for him. They said his grief seemed hollow, like a man imitating sorrow rather than feeling it. But still he kept his routine. Morning coffee at the same diner that replaced Murphy's. Evening walks to the post office. Yard work every Saturday at precisely 9. Behind that calm routine, however, there were cracks. Neighbors recalled that he never liked children coming too close to his property. His tools were always locked away, cataloged, spotless. One woman who once helped clean his house remembered a single photograph on his mantel. A faded image of him standing at the mine in his younger days, wearing his work shirt, his hand resting on the same type of tool that forensic experts would later identify as the murder weapon. For nearly half a century, he moved through life undisturbed, attending barbecues, funerals, and church gatherings with the same quiet face. No one knew that beneath that stillness lived the man who had taken everything from the Martinez family. He had not fled. He had not hidden far away. He had simply blended into the fabric of the very community that once searched for his victims. What would happen when the truth finally knocked on Howard Keller's door, and the ghosts of Blackwood Mine came calling for the man who thought he had buried them forever? The morning of October 25, 2019, began like any other in Pike County. Mist rolling over the fields, the faint hum of early traffic, church bells echoing through the valley. But before sunrise, quiet streets filled with the flashing red and blue of unmarked vehicles. At exactly 5:32 a.m., agents from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation surrounded a small white house on Willow Creek Road. Inside, the man who had lived there for decades stirred from sleep, unaware that the silence he had built his life upon was about to break forever. When the front door opened, the agents moved swiftly. Howard Keller was taken into custody without resistance, his face expressionless, his eyes unfocused. In the footage later released to the public, he stood on his porch barefoot wearing a gray robe as officers read the warrant aloud. The charge: 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. Word spread through Pike County faster than anyone could contain it. By mid-morning, the arrest had reached every news station in Alabama. Social media lit up with disbelief. The same man who had fixed fences, attended baptisms, and handed out candy on Halloween was now accused of a crime that had haunted the county for 45 years. His neighbors gathered at the end of his driveway, watching in stunned silence as he was escorted into a waiting vehicle. Some whispered prayers, others shook their heads in disbelief. At 10 o'clock, the Pike County Sheriff's Office held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Reporters filled the square, cameras flashing under the harsh morning sun. Sheriff Dawson confirmed what the rumors had already made public. The remains discovered in the Blackwood mine had been positively identified as the Martinez twins, and the evidence, both forensic and historical, had led investigators directly to Keller. The sheriff's statement was steady, but his voice faltered when he spoke about the family. He called it a tragedy that had defined generations, and a reminder that time does not erase guilt. Behind him, an enlarged photo of the twins was displayed. The same image from their missing posters, now finally paired with the word justice. Within hours, editorials began appearing online and in local papers. The headlines were unified in tone: betrayal, shock, disbelief. One column wrote, "How does a man sit among his neighbors year after year with a secret like that still breathing inside him?" Another described the arrest as the breaking of a 45-year spell. The myth had ended, and the monster had been found. In town, the reaction was a mixture of grief and relief. Some could not reconcile the quiet handyman with the image of a murderer. Others said they had always felt something cold in his eyes. But for everyone who remembered the night of October 17, 1974, The news reopened old wounds that had never fully healed. Howard Keller, the man who had lived like a ghost among them, was now the center of a storm that swept across Alabama. And as he sat behind bars, the question everyone wanted answered remained. Why had he done it? And what secret had kept him silent for nearly half a century? For decades, everyone in Pike County believed Howard Keller had been questioned and cleared back in 1974. His wife Elaine had given him an alibi that sounded simple and ordinary. She told investigators that Howard was home all evening, fixing the kitchen sink and watching television when the Martinez twins vanished. At the time, deputies had dozens of tips pouring in. Manpower was thin, and with no physical evidence tying him to the case, the matter was quietly dropped. On paper, he was clean. But what the world did not know, what even his closest neighbors never guessed, was that Elaine Keller had carried a terrible secret for 45 years. When investigators reopened the case in 2019, they obtained a warrant to search Keller's home. In the dust-choked attic, sealed inside a cedar chest, they found a small stack of weathered journals tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was delicate, but the words were heavy with fear. In those pages, Elaine spoke of a life lived in silence and intimidation. She wrote about Howard's violent temper, his unpredictable moods, and the way she had learned to speak only when spoken to. Most chillingly, in one entry dated October 18, 1974, she wrote that Howard had left the house the previous night after an argument, returning past midnight with dirt on his hands and the faint scent of gasoline on his clothes. She said he told her to stay quiet, that no one would believe her, and that if she ever spoke, she would regret it. Elaine wrote that she wanted to tell the sheriff, but could not. She described waking each night from nightmares, hearing muffled cries in her mind, seeing Howard stare out the window for hours as if something out there called his name. Her words painted a portrait not only of a man hiding a crime, but of a woman trapped inside the fear of knowing it. Those journals became the missing link that tied every unanswered question together. They proved that the alibi investigators had accepted was false, a shield crafted from terror and silence. They also revealed that Howard Keller had carefully constructed his life to appear harmless. Church volunteer, local handyman, soft-spoken neighbor, a mask worn so perfectly that no one ever looked close enough to see the cracks. When detectives read those pages aloud in the interview room, Keller reportedly lowered his eyes and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said one word: inevitable. That single word left investigators shaken. It was as if he believed that what he had done was destined, as if the guilt had long since turned into something darker. And yet, despite everything uncovered, one piece of the truth still remained buried. What exactly happened in the hours between the twins leaving the diner and their lives ending beneath the mine? Something in Keller's silence suggested there was more to the story than even the journals had revealed. Howard Keller had always been more than just another worker at the Blackwell mine. He knew its tunnels like the back of his hand. Every narrow shaft, every hidden access route, every forgotten corridor that had been sealed for safety. He was the maintenance supervisor, the man responsible for the locks, the keys, and the logs. And that made him a man with both access and opportunity. Records recovered from the old Blackwell mining archives revealed something chilling. On October 18, 1974, the morning after the Martinez twins disappeared, Keller himself had signed an inspection log authorizing entry into a section of the mine that had been closed for years. The entry was brief, written in his neat handwriting and marked complete by 11:42 a.m. At the time, no one questioned it. It was routine paperwork filed among hundreds of other safety records. But in the light of what was later discovered, that log became damning evidence, a breadcrumb left behind by his own hand. Detectives pieced together how Keller used his position to carry out what he had planned. He could move freely through the mine property without suspicion. The heavy padlocks, the sealed tunnels, the hidden shafts, they were all under his control. He had the means to conceal what he had done, and the environment itself helped him. The mine was deep, unstable, and vast. Even trained teams would not risk exploring certain areas. That made it the perfect grave. As for motive, investigators believed it began with obsession. Those who remembered Keller from the diner in 1974 said he had shown a peculiar interest in Sarah Martinez, always asking when her shift ended, always lingering near the counter, smiling just a little too long. Sarah, ever polite, had once told him she was not interested. That single rejection, combined with Keller's controlling nature and violent temper, may have been what set everything into motion. Over the years, Keller maintained a strange presence at community gatherings held in memory of the twins. He attended vigils, stood among grieving families, even offered to help with search maps. More than once he had commented quietly to others that maybe the girls had simply run off. Maybe they wanted to escape small-town life. At the time, those words sounded like speculation. Now they felt like something far more sinister, an attempt to plant doubt, to twist the truth while standing in plain sight. Neighbors recalled that Keller's eyes often lingered on the missing posters that never seemed to fade from the town's notice boards. Sometimes he would touch one gently before walking away, whispering something no one could hear. It was as if he wanted to remain connected to the lie he had built. A secret too heavy to forget, but too dark to confess. When detectives finally laid out the evidence, the mine log, the fibers, the lubricant trace, and Elaine's journals, the entire puzzle aligned. Howard Keller had motive through obsession, means through his authority, and opportunity through his unrestricted access. But even then, investigators sensed there was something deeper behind his actions. Something not yet spoken aloud. A truth that perhaps even Keller himself was afraid to face. And that truth was waiting to surface, buried not in the mine, but in the memory of a single witness who had remained silent all these years. During the second day of the search at Keller's house, investigators opened a narrow crawl space behind a false panel in his basement wall. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rusted metal. Tucked inside a wooden crate beneath old tarps and tools, they found a small locked metal box. Its surface was corroded and its hinges stiff, as though it had not been touched in decades. When the box was finally forced open, the contents sent a cold silence through the room. Inside lay a tarnished silver charm, a perfect match to the locket that had once belonged to Sarah Martinez. Under magnification, analysts later discovered microscopic traces of dried blood embedded in its clasp. Next to it was a faded blue ribbon, brittle with age, and strands of human hair woven around its knot. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already feared. It belonged to Rebecca. The discovery turned Keller's basement into a crime scene frozen in time. Every inch was carefully documented. Investigators moved with deliberate precision, each object tagged and photographed. But it was the second item found in that crate that deepened the mystery even more. An old, spiral-bound maintenance log from the Blackwell mine. It should have been archived decades ago, yet here it was, hidden among Keller's personal belongings. Flipping through the log, detectives noticed that several pages were missing. The surviving ones were marked with faint calculations, angles, measurements, and coordinates scribbled in pencil. At first the numbers seemed meaningless, but when overlaid with the original mine maps, the notations pointed directly toward the section where the Martinez twins' remains had been found. It was as if Keller had left a coded confession in plain sight, a secret record of his own handiwork. Investigators believed he had returned to that log repeatedly over the years, tracing over the numbers, reliving what he had done. The worn edges of the pages suggested that the book had been opened many times. Those who examined the evidence later described the experience as haunting. It was not just proof of guilt. It was a window into the mind of a man who had lived alongside his crime, nurturing it in silence. The items he kept were not trophies of victory but tokens of control. He had locked away pieces of his victims' lives to ensure they would never truly leave him. When the evidence was presented to the forensic team, One veteran investigator reportedly stepped back and said softly that monsters do not always hide in shadows. Sometimes, they build lives in daylight. The basement yielded everything Keller had buried from the world. Every lie, every secret, every trace of the past he tried to seal away. But there was still one more question that no piece of evidence could yet answer. Why had he kept it all? What did those numbers and objects mean to him after all these years? When the cold case team revisited the old witness reports, one detail kept surfacing: the blue Ford pickup with the dented fender. It had been seen near Pine Street the night the twins vanished, yet no evidence at the time tied it directly to the crime. But with modern forensics and the renewed investigation, that long-forgotten lead finally came back into focus. Through vehicle registry archives, detectives tracked the truck's ownership history and found that Keller had quietly sold it in early 1975, only months after the disappearance. The vehicle had since changed hands several times across the South, eventually ending up in a private collection in Georgia. The collector, unaware of its history, had preserved it in original condition, dust, rust, and all. When Alabama investigators arrived to examine it, they treated the vehicle as if it had just been impounded from a fresh crime scene. Every inch was swabbed and scanned using advanced luminol and microchemical methods that did not exist in the 1970s. The process took days, and the team was prepared for disappointment. But then, beneath the steel framework under the passenger seat, something extraordinary surfaced. Faint traces of biological residue embedded deep into the metal grain. The samples were so small, they had to be extracted under a microscope. Yet when the DNA results returned, the findings were undeniable. The blood traces matched both Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. It was not enough to suggest a struggle, but enough to prove contact. The pattern of residue on the floorboard suggested that one or both girls had been transported in that truck, either unconscious or worse. Investigators stood in the dimly lit forensics lab as the results were read aloud. The silence that followed was heavy. Decades of doubt had finally been replaced with proof. The blue Ford pickup, once a fleeting sight in witness statements, had now become the silent witness that spoke after 45 years of silence. The discovery tied every thread of the case together: the vehicle sightings, the mine log, the hidden artifacts, and the obsessive connection Keller had maintained to the scene of his crime. It was irrefutable, scientific, and final. The blood beneath that passenger seat carried the weight of truth that no confession ever could. When Keller's attorney was informed of the findings, the accused man reportedly looked down and asked one quiet question: how did they find that after all this time? The answer, investigators said, was simple: the truth had never really left. It had only waited for the right eyes, the right hands, and the right moment to be seen. But while the physical evidence had sealed Keller's fate, the emotional core of the story still remained with those left behind. The Martinez family, whose lives had been frozen since that October night. What happened when they finally heard the words they had been waiting to hear for almost half a century would stay with the entire county forever. The arrest of Howard Keller and the mountain of evidence that followed did more than close a case. It tore open the quiet heart of Pike County. For weeks, the town felt suspended between disbelief and reflection. People walked slower through the grocery aisles, greeted each other softly at the post office, and avoided looking toward Willow Creek Road. The realization sank in that the man who had lived among them for so long, who had fixed their porches and prayed beside them in church, had carried within him something unspeakable. For many, the shock was not only in what Keller had done, but in how easily he had hidden it. His house had been on the same street where children played, where neighbors borrowed tools, where people waved as they passed. He had lived like a shadow stitched into the fabric of their lives, always there, but never truly seen. That was what unsettled them most. Local radio hosts and newspaper columns began asking the same question. How can a man live decades in plain sight, carrying a crime that monstrous without anyone ever knowing? The answer came from a visiting psychologist brought in to speak at a town forum on trauma and trust. She explained that predators who blend into communities often rely on patterns of normalcy. They wear politeness like a uniform. They learn routines, gestures, and words that make them appear harmless. They do not stand out, they blend in, and that is what allows their darkness to survive for so long. Her words hit the audience hard. Dozens sat in silence as she continued, saying that the human mind does not want to believe evil can live next door. It wants comfort, not suspicion. It wants to believe that kindness means safety. And that need to trust, that is what people like Keller exploit most. After the talk, several residents admitted they had felt uneasy around him at times. A few recalled how Keller would linger in conversation too long, or shift topics suddenly when the twins' case came up. But back then, suspicion felt cruel. No one wanted to think that way about a neighbor. And so the truth stayed hidden behind Southern hospitality and polite smiles. The sheriff described it best when he said that evil had learned to bow its head in church. Keller's disguise had not been made of lies. It had been made of routine. The case forced Pike County to look inward, not only at the man who had committed the crime, but at the quiet trust that allowed it to remain buried for so long. People began locking their doors more often, not out of fear but out of awareness. A sense of innocence had been lost, replaced by something more grounded, more watchful. And yet, through all the sorrow, the community found strength in unity. They held candlelight vigils for Sarah and Rebecca, not just to mourn, but to reclaim the memory of two lives stolen and silenced. But even as the town began to heal, investigators uncovered one final piece of Keller's past, a link that stretched beyond Pike County, suggesting his darkness may not have begun or ended there. When Howard Keller was brought into the courthouse for his arraignment, the hallway was filled with a heavy silence. Reporters stood ready, cameras humming softly, but no one spoke above a whisper. Every eye turned when the side door opened and an older man, moving slowly but firmly, entered the room. It was Robert Martinez, and father of Sarah and Rebecca. His face carried the weight of 45 years of waiting, years marked by unanswered prayers and fading hope. He took a seat in the second row, his hands clasped together, a folded handkerchief trembling between his fingers. Across the room, Keller was led in wearing a gray jumpsuit, wrists bound, head lowered. For a brief moment, the two men shared a glance, one filled with grief, the other hollow and unreadable. The sheriff later said that single look felt like the closing of a circle. Maria Martinez did not attend. Those close to the family said she could not bear to see the face of the man who had taken everything from her. She remained at home, surrounded by candles and framed photos of her daughters, whispering prayers as the hearing began. When the judge read the charges aloud, 2 counts of first-degree murder, the courtroom fell still. Robert did not flinch. He simply watched, his expression calm but distant, as if his emotions had burned themselves out long ago. When the session ended, he stepped outside to a wall of microphones. In a soft, steady voice, he thanked the investigators who had never stopped searching. He said justice had finally found its way home, but that justice after 45 years could never feel complete. His words carried no anger, but only exhaustion. He said that truth had come too late for healing, but not too late for peace. His son Miguel spoke briefly afterward, standing beside his father. He said that their family's faith had kept them alive, even when everything else had fallen apart. He called the verdict a blessing and a wound at the same time. Gratitude for the truth, sorrow for the years it took to find it. He ended by saying that his sisters could finally rest, and that their names would never again be spoken with uncertainty. When the family left the courthouse, the crowd stepped aside in silence. No applause, no shouting. Only the sound of footsteps on cold pavement and the faint rustle of leaves in the courthouse square. But as reporters filed their stories that evening, one headline began circulating online, a claim that hinted Keller's past might have reached farther than Pike County. Records from out of state had begun to surface, suggesting another disappearance with his name hidden deep inside the files. The trial of Howard Keller left Pike County shaken, but what followed in the weeks after his arrest became something far greater than grief. It became reflection, healing, and unity. The town that had once whispered about the Martinez twins now spoke their names with reverence. Community leaders organized a series of open town halls inside the courthouse auditorium. The goal was simple: to teach vigilance, to help people recognize the quiet signs of danger that had gone unseen for decades. Parents, teachers, and law enforcement filled the rows, sharing stories and questions. The conversations were emotional but necessary. One mother stood and said softly that trust is not weakness, but trust without awareness is blindness. The room fell silent after her words. Pike County was learning not only how to protect its people, but how to forgive itself. Soon after, the Troy Historical Society announced a new initiative, a scholarship fund in the names of Sarah and Rebecca Martinez. Each year it would support 2 local students pursuing nursing and music, honoring the dreams the sisters never had the chance to fulfill. The announcement drew tears from those who had known the girls, and even those who had only grown up hearing their story. It felt like the town had finally found a way to give something back, to turn sorrow into purpose. Meanwhile, a quiet memorial began to form outside Keller's old home on Willow Creek Road. It started with a single white lily placed by a stranger, then grew overnight into a wall of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. People came not to curse the house but to reclaim it. They left messages for the twins, prayers for the family, and promises that their story would never fade again. Even after the memorial was cleared weeks later, 2 small wooden crosses remained by the mailbox. No one claimed to have placed them there. Yet every morning someone seemed to refresh the flowers laid at their base. It became a quiet ritual, the town's way of saying that even in darkness, remembrance is a kind of light. For Pike County, the story of the Martinez twins was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a reminder of how evil hides in silence and how truth can still rise, even after generations of forgetting. But as peace began to settle over the town, a new file landed on an investigator's desk, one that suggested Keller's crimes might not have been isolated to Alabama. March of 2020 brought the end of one of the longest and most haunting chapters in Pike County's history. The courthouse looked different this time. Masks covered faces. Seats were spaced apart. The world outside was gripped by fear of a spreading pandemic. But inside that old wooden courtroom, another kind of reckoning was about to unfold. Howard Keller, frail and pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, sat at the defense table. His hair had thinned to white. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the glasses perched on his nose. Yet despite the weight of the charges, he showed no emotion, no remorse, no anger, nothing. Just the same stillness that had once helped him hide in plain sight. The prosecution began with quiet precision. Over several days they presented a timeline that stretched back 45 years. They laid out the mine inspection log, the recovered truck, the blood traces, the locket, and Elaine Keller's handwritten journals. Forensic experts took the stand one after another, walking the jury through DNA comparisons, mineral residue, and even the proprietary lubricant that tied every thread of the crime back to Keller's own workbench. When the photographs of the recovered items were displayed on the screen, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Sarah's charm, Rebecca's ribbon, the numbers in the maintenance log. Each piece of evidence was a voice speaking from the past, together forming the story Keller had tried to bury. The defense leaned heavily on his age and frailty. They argued that Keller was an old man, incapable of withstanding a prison sentence. They spoke of his declining health, his isolation, and his failing memory. But through it all, Keller himself never spoke. Not a single word. Even when the judge asked if he wished to make a statement, he simply stared forward, unblinking. It was as though his silence had become his last form of control. When deliberations began, the jury took less than 4 hours. At 5:46 p.m., they returned to the courtroom. The foreperson stood, her voice trembling slightly as she read the verdicts aloud, guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the words echoed. Judge Harris, known for his calm demeanor, took a long pause before delivering the sentence. He said that time does not erase accountability, and that justice delayed is still justice served. He then imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. But before he closed the session, he spoke one final line that the town would remember for years. He said, "Some men bury bodies, others bury truth. Both will always be found in time." Keller was led away quietly, his expression unchanged, his eyes fixed somewhere no one else could see. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall over the courthouse square. People stood under umbrellas, not speaking, just watching the prisoner van disappear into the gray horizon. And while the trial had brought closure to one family and one town, a chilling whisper still lingered. A question of how many other towns, how many other families, might still be waiting for their truth to be unearthed. 2 weeks after the sentencing, the Martinez family home grew quiet once more. The news crews had left. The crowds outside the courthouse had faded. For the first time in decades, Pike County felt still. But inside that small brick house on Elm Street, time was running out for one man who had carried the weight of grief longer than anyone should. Robert Martinez passed away peacefully in his sleep, just 14 days after Keller's conviction. He was found in his armchair by the window, the same place he had sat for years waiting for answers that finally came too late. On the table beside him rested an old newspaper folded neatly, its front page showing Keller in handcuffs beneath the headline, "Justice Served." His heart had endured what it had needed to. His family said he left with peace, knowing his daughters were no longer lost. Maria, though frail, found a new strength in the days that followed. For 45 years, she had refused to touch Sarah and Rebecca's bedroom. The curtains had stayed drawn, their beds perfectly made, the air heavy with the past. But one quiet morning she opened the door, let the sunlight spill in, and began to pack their belongings. She placed each item with care, the nursing textbooks, the worn guitar picks, the photographs taped to the mirror. She donated their clothes to the church thrift drive, whispering prayers as she folded each piece. But 2 things she could not let go of: the framed photo of the twins taken at Murphy's Diner and Rebecca's old guitar, still with the faded sticker that read, "Nashville or Nothing." Those remained by her bedside, silent reminders of lives interrupted yet finally at rest. Miguel and Lucia, now both adults with families of their own, decided that their parents' pain should not be repeated for others. Together they established the Martinez Foundation for Cold Case Forensics, partnering with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation and several universities. Their mission was clear: to fund modern forensic tools to train investigators and to make sure that no case, no matter how old, would ever be forgotten again. The foundation grew quickly, supported by donations from across the state. Every year they held a candlelight event in Troy's Courthouse Square. Locals gathered to honor victims whose stories had gone cold, each name spoken aloud under the glow of 1,000 small lights. And when Sarah and Rebecca's names were called, the crowd always fell silent, the sound of wind moving softly through the trees. The Martinez family's story had begun with tragedy, but it ended with purpose. Through loss, they had built something lasting, a beacon for others still searching in the dark. And somewhere beyond the walls of that old house, beneath the Alabama sky, the faint notes of Rebecca's guitar could almost be imagined again, carried gently on the wind, a sound of peace and of home finally found. Years passed, and what began as one family's tragedy slowly transformed into a story that changed how justice was pursued across Alabama. The Martinez case became more than a solved mystery. It became a blueprint, a lesson in patience, in persistence, and in the power of truth that refuses to die. Law enforcement agencies began using the case as a model in their training programs. Recruits studying forensic recovery, behavioral profiling, and investigative cold case work all learned the same message: that even the smallest detail, even one overlooked clue, can be the key that unlocks decades of silence. The Blackwood mine discovery was no longer just a chapter in Pike County's history. It was now required reading in state police academies. In classrooms filled with young cadets, instructors spoke about the value of revisiting old evidence with new eyes and the danger of dismissing what appears ordinary. Beyond the force, Pike County itself began to change. Inspired by the Martinez Foundation, citizens formed a volunteer network that worked alongside investigators to spread awareness, distribute missing persons materials, and organize annual safety drives. Retired teachers, small business owners, and even high school students joined the cause. Their goal was simple: to make sure no one vanished without being remembered. At Troy High School, a new elective appeared in the curriculum: community safety and awareness. The course used real case studies, including the story of the Martinez twins, to teach students about trust, boundaries, and vigilance. Survivors and investigators often came to speak, turning the pain of the past into education for the future. Over time, the town began to heal not through forgetting, but through learning. Murals appeared on brick walls downtown. Portraits of Sarah with her nursing badge and Rebecca with her guitar under her arm, smiling at the horizon. Beneath them were the words, "Truth always rises." Every October 17th, the town still gathers at dusk in front of the old courthouse. Candles are lit, prayers are whispered, and the names of the twins are spoken once more. Their story reminds everyone that evil can hide in the most ordinary faces, but hope, too, can rise from the quietest hearts. Pike County became known not for the darkness that once haunted it, but for how it faced that darkness and refused to let it win. And as the lights flicker against the night sky, one feeling lingers, the sense that somewhere, Sarah and Rebecca are finally at peace, their story no longer buried, but living on in every lesson learned and every truth still waiting to be found. Winter settled heavy over Alabama in January 2022. The air outside Holman Correctional was still, quiet and gray when Howard Keller was found lifeless in his cell. Heart failure, the warden said. No last words. No letter, no remorse. He took his silence with him, the same silence that had haunted Pike County for 48 long years. For some, it felt like the final chapter of a nightmare finally closing. But for others it was something different. It was not about vengeance. It was about peace, the kind that comes slowly, like sunlight returning after a storm. When the news reached Miguel and Lucia, they did not speak much. They just sat together on the porch of their parents' old house, the same place where two little girls once ran laughing through the yard. The wind carried the faint chime of Rebecca's guitar, the one her mother had kept all those years. It was not sadness they felt now. It was release. Keller had lived among them for decades, eating at the same diner, nodding to the same neighbors, pretending to be good. And yet through it all, justice had waited, quietly, patiently, until truth finally rose to the surface. Sarah and Rebecca's names were carved into stone now, but more importantly, they were etched into the hearts of a whole community. Every candle lit in their memory, every scholarship awarded, every young girl taught to stay aware. That was their legacy. And as the years moved forward, Pike County never forgot. The people learned that monsters can wear gentle smiles, but courage can live in the smallest of places, in a brother who never stopped searching, in a mother who kept her faith, and in a town that refused to stop asking why. The story of the Martinez twins ended not with the sound of sirens, but with a deep, quiet truth that justice, no matter how long it hides, will always find its way home. If you are still here watching this story till the end, it truly means this story touched you, so please give it a like and make sure you subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss the stories that deserve to be heard. My mother set a goal for this story: 5,000 likes. Let us make it happen together, because every like helps keep real stories alive. and tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this story tonight?